Is perfection killing music? Let's dig in. Before we get started, I want to ask you to like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. I'm trying to build the channel and your support is really helpful. So first of all, this is not a middle-aged man complaining about modern music. I really love modern music. I love modern music production, and I don't think that every modern rock band or metal band should sound like Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath. But I am concerned that our search for perfection is having a negative impact on music and musicians. I wonder if musicians have an unrealistic expectation of what they have to achieve in a studio, and also an unrealistic expectations of what the studio can do to make them perfect. So where does this come from? Well, last week I was in the studio and I was having a chat with one of my clients who was talking about how he was not a perfect guitar player. And I told him, do you know what, music's not supposed to be perfect. And then that kind of got me wondering, like, where are we with this right now? Does this mean that musicians and producers have forgotten about the human part of making music? Of course they realise that there's exceptions to the rule. There is definitely some music that requires perfection. Modern metal needs to be super tight. Bands that are playing along to loops need to be perfectly in time to make those loops work. And then there's a lot of genres of music that use Autotune as an effect rather than a tool. So here's the position I find myself in. I grew up listening to a lot of organic music, stuff that was tracked live, stuff that was tracked to tape, and probably didn't see anything like auto-tune or time aligning. But I also love modern music. Currently I'm listening to Era's new album and it is absolutely fantastic and is absolutely an example of modern music production. But I love a natural and human music performance. At the same time, I'm also not afraid to use modern production techniques to improve those performances. The thing about them though is I don't like using them to their full degree. I don't like using them up full. I only like to use them to fix little issues in what is already a really great music performance. Of course, I want music to be in time. Of course I want music to be in tune, but does it need to be perfectly in time the whole time? No. Does it need to be perfectly in tune the whole time? Not really. I'm interested in the performance. I'm interested in the push and pull. I don't mind if a chorus is a little bit faster. I don't mind if a middle eight is a little bit slower. I don't mind if the outro pushes. That's what live performance is all about, and I find that exciting. There are loads of amazing records out there where things are not perfectly in time and not perfectly in tune. If you think about things like the Beatles, it was all done live. And a great example of a song that isn't perfectly in tune is Higher and Higher by Jackie Wilson. I'm convinced that that intro guitar is not in tune, but does it bother me? No, I think it's great. So let's have a wee look at some of the music production tools that might be getting overused these days. Time aligning and quantizing. So this is a really big one for me. So if you don't know what time aligning and quantizing is there's a bunch of tools out there that can take a performance that isn't in time and make it perfectly in time. If you're a Pro Tools user, you'll know Beat Detective and Elastic Audio. And what they can do is that they can detect the performance and they can put it absolutely 100% in perfect timing. The problem with that for me is it then starts to feel really robotic. It might be perfect, but it's at the cost of groove and feel. And that's something that is really important to me. As I said before, I like the push and pull. That's human and that's exciting. Putting something perfectly and robotically in time, that isn't exciting for me. So here's a really interesting question to ask yourself. When you listen to a record that is quantized to within an inch of its life, and then you go to see that band live, are they going to be quantized live? No. Is it going to be absolutely perfect? No. Is it going to have push and pull? Of course. Even if they are using click tracks, it's still not going to be robotically perfect. Are you going to love it? Hell yeah. You're still excited by the human nature of a live performance. If you weren't, nobody would go to live gigs. So here's what I like to do in the studio. And this is the part where I'm going to use a little of the old school and a little of the new school. I like bands to record to click tracks. Now, I'm doing that as a reference point for the drummer to keep them in time, to keep them in check. And because I'm using a click track, I can also do something called playlisting. If you don't know what playlisting is, it's basically when I can create a playlist of various takes and refer back to them at any point. And once I've built up a playlist of maybe 3 or 4 absolutely amazing takes, I can then comp them together or splice them together to make the perfect take. And once I've got this spliced together, I can then start addressing any of the more obvious timing issues with that. Now, what I'm not doing is going bar by bar and picking the perfect bar and splicing that all together into one, frankly, unnatural performance. What I always do with a playlist is I have one take which I think is the best, it's got the best vibe and the best groove to it. And then if there's any issues with fills or parts that aren't quite right, I will borrow from the other takes and splice that together. And then again, I'll go through and address any major timing issues or obvious timing issues. But I'm not going bar by bar and making it absolutely perfect. And when I'm using stuff like Beat Detective and Elastic Audio, I'm not snapping 100% to the grid. I tend to set my Beat Detective to maybe 90 to 95%. And sometimes if I'm using Elastic Audio, rather than snapping to the grid, I just manually move it so that it's a little bit imperfect. Because you know what? Music is imperfect. Now there's other things that I like to use to improve timing, and a big one for me is a plugin called Vocal Align. This is an amazing plugin which basically helps get things like backing vocals a little bit tighter. Now you can set that to basically make all of your backing vocals exactly the same. How it works roughly is that you set a master track and then basically it lines up any other tracks in the stack to that and makes it perfect. Now there is a version of that not only deals with the timing but also the pitch. I don't really use that and I don't really go for that either. Why? Because it's the push and pull between pitch and timing that adds the richness. I did a video on it before, you can go and watch it. This natural chorusing from the push and pull that comes from the different performances really adds up to something amazing. So if I have a plugin that basically makes them all exactly the same timing and exactly the same pitch, I don't really see the point. And again, when you go to see a band live and they're singing, they're not perfect, and that's okay. So when I'm using Vocal Align, I tend to only line up the timing so that they all start and stop at the same point. And again, I never set it to 100%. Next up is vocal tuning. Now this one's a big one for me because I don't always enjoy the artifacts and the tonality that comes from vocal tuning. But first and foremost, I do actually use Autotune, but I prefer Melodyne. And the reason for that is that Melodyne allows me to use it manually rather than automatically. And that's really good for just basically taking care of one little problem rather than conforming the whole thing from start to finish to be absolutely perfect. Autotune is really, really good for tightening up backing vocals. I do like to do that a lot, but again, not too much. I never set it to 100%. I don't mind there being a little push and pull on the pitch. Autotune can also be good for other instruments as well. In the past, I've used it on bass guitar and violins, or fiddles as we call them in Scotland, and that's a great tool for, again, just tightening up the pitch of some of these things which can go slightly awry sometimes. But as I said, I much prefer to use Melodyne, because what I can do is I can go in and manually edit the problems rather than the whole thing. So if I've got a great vocal tape but maybe one note is slightly out, then what I can do is I can open up Melodyne and I can nudge that into place. But what's interesting is that I never tend to nudge it perfectly to the grid or the piano roll, because sometimes when you set it to be absolutely perfect, it just doesn't sit well with me. So I'm always going to do it the old-fashioned way and use my ears. Now, my big issue with tuning plugins is the artifacts that it brings in when you overuse it. We all know that kind of auto-tune thing where it goes blah, 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 and I'm not really into that. And I think if you are using auto-tune that hard, then basically there's been a problem with the performance. I would much rather go back and get multiple takes of good performances and borrow parts from it to make up one amazing one. I think Autotune is generally really good at maybe getting an extra 10-20% out of a performance, but when you push it too hard, I just don't like it. But obviously in some genres like hip hop, R&B, dance, pop, etc., Autotune is used as an effect, and that's cool if that's what you're looking for. I'm trying to create great rock, indie and metal music, and I just prefer it to be a little bit more natural and a little bit more human. Next up, MIDI drums. So using MIDI drums in your music's absolutely fine. Sometimes we don't have access to a drummer, and sometimes we don't have access to a space to record that drummer. So using a MIDI drum kit is a great solution to that problem. But here's where it gets interesting. The key to a great MIDI drum track is actually humanizing them. No human drummer can play exactly in time and exactly the same velocity each time. So it's that inconsistency that makes it feel real. So when we're programming MIDI drums, what we're not doing is making every hit exactly on time and every hit exactly the same velocity, because it will sound absolutely awful. We're always trying to make it feel like a real person behind that drum kit. Quite often I'll use groove packs when I'm programming drums. These are preset patterns that you can buy online, and they're super useful. The other thing about them is they're already humanized. They're not all perfectly in time, and they're not all exactly the same velocity. There's push and pull in the performance. The velocities on every single hit of a snare, for example, will be ever so slightly different. If you change that, it basically starts to get robotic and it doesn't feel real. So if the key to great sounding MIDI drums is humanizing them, that opens up a question. Should we not be leaning into just making music more human? Next up, drum samples. So using drum samples alongside acoustic drums is nothing new. It's been happening for years and years and years. In fact, I saw a video with Paul Simon who was talking about his Graceland album, and he opened up the session for the song Call Me Al on his mixing desk, and lo and behold, he was using samples in that mix. The truth is, the vast majority of records that I make have drum samples in them. But my preference is to use samples to enhance the drums, not 100% replace them. I have a kind of 33% rule. My drums should be no more than 33% samples. The rest of it should be the real drum. If I'm having to fully replace a drum with a sample, that basically means there's been a problem at source. Maybe someone sent me a drum kit and I'm not happy with the way that it's been recorded, or maybe I just fucked it up and I need to replace it. But I'm only 100% replacing when I can't work with what's been recorded. Now, another issue for me is that drum sample packs tend to be heavily processed, essentially pre-mixed. But that's an issue for me because they've been pre-mixed to nothing. They haven't been pre-mixed to the sounds that I'm using. So if they don't fit with the sounds I'm using, they're going to sound really unnatural. However, these pre-mixed samples can be really great for reinforcing acoustic drums that you've recorded. If those samples have been pre-mixed to be super aggressive, dialing in that aggression underneath your recorded drum can be really useful. And I do it all the time. And if I find myself in a position where I'm having to completely replace a drum, then I'm going to try and use something that is a little bit more raw and a little bit more unmixed. That way I can kind of develop that in the mix along with the instruments around it. One of the things that I do on pretty much every recording session I do is sample the raw drum kit as I record it. Then I can use these raw samples when I have to completely replace something. Super useful. So my conclusions. Is perfection ruining music? I don't know. Is it really my place to say? I'm not into it personally, and that's fine. If you want your music to be absolutely perfect, if the music that you're working on needs to be absolutely perfect, then great, go for it. But for me, I really love that human element in music. And I just worry that maybe we've forgotten a little bit about that, particularly younger musicians. I can remember being in the studio with a young musician, and he went away to record his own vocals at home because he felt a bit more comfortable with it. When they sent them over to me, I could swear they had been tuned because I could hear the step nature in the vocals. So I said to him, "Did you tune those vocals?" "No," he said. So he was kind of singing as if he was auto-tuned. And that's not the first time that I've found that with younger singers. And I also think that making things perfectly in time and perfectly in tune and making it basically inhuman is making music feel a little bit stale. It doesn't excite me. What does excite me is going to a live show and seeing a band do their thing on stage. And that excites loads of other people too. So why don't we just lean into that a little bit more? Why should we not have that energy and emotion on a record? As I said earlier, if we weren't excited by live music, nobody would go and see gigs. But the reality is millions of people go to see live music every year. And again, live music is not perfect, but we still all get super excited. We move, we bounce, we scream. I want to try and get that on record. That's the way I like to make music. And again, I'm not afraid of using these tools to make these a little bit better, but I just don't want to make it 100% perfect. Now, if you want me to make your music 100% perfect, I can do that. I know how to. It just doesn't excite me that much, but I can absolutely do it. Again, if I'm working with a metal band, like, that's cool. And at the end of the day, If your record sounds great and exciting, then who cares how you got there? Again, I listen to a lot of modern metal and I love the sound of those records. And a lot of those records are absolutely edited within an inch of their life. And that's cool, they still excite me. But probably not as much as seeing them live. And the other question I like to ask myself is that whilst like modern metal and technical music like that, or electronic music does need to be perfect, does that need to translate everywhere? Does your country record need to be perfectly in time? Does your indie record need to be perfectly in time? Again, I don't think so, but I guess that's up to you to decide. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.